guys ready to start? Okay. So I'm Sudha. I'm the Big Sky Watershed Core member with Madison Conservation District. And so thank you guys for being here to kick off our new series. This is a conservation speaker series. And we decided to put this on because after the success of our small acreages workshop, we wanted to continue supporting the community. So we partnered with Ruby Valley Conservation District. So hoping to reach all types of landowners to provide information and resources to you. So this is the first event. Kerri and Shannon are here from DNRC to discuss water rights. And we'll continue the series on the second and fourth Wednesdays of this month and next month. So the next event is on March 22nd, covering pollinators and pollinator gardens. On April 12th, we'll be talking about rotational grazing and electric fencing. And our final event on April 26th will be on soil health and testing. So all of the events will be here from 5 to 6:30. We want to thank our sponsors for helping us put on this event. And that is Madison Valley Women's Club, Walters Family Foods, and Frontier Earthworks. So thank you to them for helping make this happen. And without further ado, Kerri and Shannon.
All right, thank you. And again, our apologies for our delay in arrival. It's all my fault. Okay, so water rights. And I love interactive presentations. So just ask questions as we go. We're happy to just have a good discussion, hopefully, with any questions or comments you might have. Let's see. I was gonna say I could come over here just to do it, but.
Yeah, maybe it's, oh, here's a on-off switch.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
But it still doesn't.
Is it frozen? As I get my keyboard to move.
No,
you have it.
it said this.
Did it have a little Bluetooth receiver?
No, it's just a USB thing. Yeah,
We can
maybe.
make it work with the laptop. No worries. Okay. So we're from the Bozeman Regional Office. We cover Gallatin, Madison, and Park counties. They keep us very busy. And then as you can see, the state's broken up into other regions as well. And we can help anyone from any part of the state generally, but there are regional expertise, such as things of ditches and public water supplies, where it's best to contact your local regional office. Just a quick listing of the staff in our office. We are currently going through some staff transitions. Part of the reason that we are a little behind today. We have a brand new appropriation specialist, and our adjudication specialists have both gone on to bigger and better things. And so we are hiring 2 positions there as well. So that keeps us busy. Always happy to help. So the DNRC mission statement, as you can see, we're promoting and coordinating the beneficial use, conservation, protection, and development of Montana's water resources for present and future generations. So what I always like to point out is we're promoting the beneficial use while protecting senior water rights. And that's really where the balance is our challenge in water rights, is what can we allow through permitting and changing to occur while still protecting those senior water rights on the ground that have been operating for over 100 years. So I always try to have 3 main points for every presentation because we learned that in communication classes. So for tonight, our top 3, all water uses should have a paper water right. There's only a few exceptions to this. And this includes places of storage or ponds/reservoirs. And I'll talk about the very few exceptions. And then water rights need maintenance, just like any other property right. Do you use it or lose it does have a component of truth. And records, are our records accurate? We rely on you, as some of us well know, to come in and make sure we've got everything right. And then 3, you're in a closed basin, so new large uses of water aren't often readily available, so. So it's in the Constitution that the water is owned by the state for the use of the people. And so people get a water right, which is a right to use the water. And you can appropriate water through different means of diversion, impounding or withdrawing. And then the water has to be put to a beneficial use. There's no wasting of water, and then there's no speculative holding of water for future use. So water rights are property rights. They have value. They can be bought and sold separately from the land. They can't be taken away without due process. So no one can just come take a water right. It has to go through some sort of court process in Montana for it to be shrunk and or dismissed, abandoned, etc. And as mentioned earlier, protected by the Constitution. So in Montana, we're a prior appropriation state. First in time is first in right. So everything is looked at by priority date. So some of the oldest priority dates are like the 1860s in Montana. And so one point I always like to make when talking about this is, so there's Western water law, and there's also Eastern water law, or the riparian doctrine. And we see this a lot in our office when people move here from the East Coast. They get confused because they came from the eastern part of the country where if you can access it, you can use it. So they buy property on a creek and they're like, yes, we got water, and they throw their pump in. They don't know that that water is already appropriated 4 or 5 times over. So that's where we always ask for everyone's help and educating new neighbors who may come from a different part of the country where the rules and laws are different. So. Forgot I made the fancy clickers. So just some basic principles to also keep in mind. Another way Montana is unique from other states is there's no hierarchy of uses. All uses are considered equal. So like in some of the more developed states like Colorado, the municipal will be considered priority over other uses, but Montana does not have that yet. And actually that is something that some groups, I think ag groups in particular, really have an intent to lobby against. They don't want to see a hierarchy of uses. And so Montana has held that way so far. As I mentioned, use it or lose it. There's a little bit of an aspect of that in Montana. Now, I think I also like to call it an urban legend, because sometimes I think it gets talked about a little bit out of proportion, because like I said, there's a due process. If you don't use it, it's not like someone is like watching and comes and takes it away necessarily, but your neighbors could see that and take you into court to say, we think you've abandoned it. But there's always, in Montana, as of now, there's a court process that would have to occur. After final decree, we do have a forfeiture statute that has 10 years. So we use 10 years in our new appropriations as kind of a guideline. And there is an extra burden in going through our change process if the water hasn't been used in 10 years. We just ask for some additional language on why restarting that use won't cause an adverse effect. But we can never declare anything abandoned. That's not something we can do. Only a court can do that. Forfeiture, final decree, we don't know what that's going to look like. There's a group, one of our comprehensive water challenge groups, has been looking at that. There are a couple bills in legislative session now to make some changes now that we're closer to final decrees and we know what they might look like. But yeah, right now it's all courts. So water is also limited to its historic use. You can't continually expand. It's 20 acres generally is 20 acres worth of water, right? But we do see sometimes people change their place of use a little bit. And so that can be problematic if there's been like this incremental expansion. So that's just something to be, I put out there as a caution. Because we've seen that before too, and then you come in through a change process and we're like, but you only had this much water, so just something to be aware of. And then no adversely affecting neighbors, and again, beneficial use has been mentioned. This one, I'm just gonna briefly, so what we are doing is we are implementing what we've been told to do through, a lot of it's through statutes, through Montana Code annotated. And then there's case law, that is the other side. So those are the two main components of where we get our direction. And then we are directed to do administrative rules. And so that fills out a lot of what the laws don't have. And then we do have some agency internal guidelines and policies as well. But the majority comes through courts and legislators. So we have, along with the Constitution, the 1973 Water Use Act really put in place also what we do and why we do it. So it was effective on July 1st, 1973. That's what I call the magical date in water rights history. So everything before that was very different than everything after that. And it set up DNRC as the record keeper for all the water rights. And then the process to account for all the water rights. So the pre-73 water rights are the claims that go through the water court, set up that process. And then it set up how to get new water rights after that, what we call new appropriations, so permitting and or filing notices. That all kind of was lined out in the Water Use Act. So water rights record keeping is one of our main tasks and one of our most important ones. And so what we track all these elements. And so Shannon and myself will mention maintenance a lot during this. And when we say maintenance, we're talking about elements that we're tracking in our records. So like ownership is a critical element. You know, priority date is critical, but that one is often fairly static. We don't see issues with that too much. What we really want to make sure is represented accurately is your point of diversion, or where you're taking your water from the source, and your place of use, where you have the right to use the water. Those are kind of the critical elements. But we also track, you know, the period, how long you're using the water, how long you can divert the water, period of use, period of diversion. The diversion rate's also critical to make sure that you're within that amount, that flow rate that you're taking it from the source. And then some water rights have a volume, an annual volume too. Yeah.
So did I understand you correctly? Like, let's say you're subdividing your property and on there, you would have to go through the courts in order to have water rights delegated to the different sections.
Not necessarily. So if you already have an established water right and you're subdividing it, if the subdivision's all within the place of use and you're keeping the use in the subdivision, what we do is we actually either will split the water right to the different subdivision lots then and make different rights.
Or what if you want to keep the rights from one to add to another?
So there's a lot of different scenarios on that, but that's probably a change in place of use potentially. And Shannon will be talking more about that.
Okay.
But yeah, there are ways to handle it for sure. But yeah, so the stuff to making sure everything's right and tracking is important on the elements. There, good there near the questions. Love the questions, keep them coming. So then just talking about types of water rights. You know, the pre-July 1st, 1973, always generalized to statements of claims, but we also have exempt from filing rights. So the very few rights that can still be used today that don't have to have a paper water right are those claims that didn't have to be filed for domestic or stock use, put into place either prior to 1962 or that were put into place between 1962 and 1973 and filed on in the county. Was our one really complex nuance is there was a groundwater code requirement, and groundwater use had to be filed in the county after 1962. So that's something like if there's a house and it was built in the 50s and it's got a well and you can't find the water right for the well, it's probably okay. We're not going to hear about that. And we had another filing. Many of you maybe were here. Remember, we had a late claim filing period open, and there was another chance to file those rights. The one thing that the law changed at that time is that these non-filed rights, if you didn't file them, you can't enforce them against others. So you don't effectively have a priority date, but you still have the right to use them. So that's kind of the complex nuance with those older stock groundwater or direct from source, and then domestic groundwater type rights. And then there's also the federal and Indian reserved rights. Murphy rights, a type of claim that was the Fish, Wildlife and Parks and stream flow that they were allowed to file later. And then I just mentioned the groundwater code. So those are kind of our specifics for pre-73 use. And then new approach after July 1st, 1973, that's where our permitting and exemptions and changes. And then there's also state water reservations in that group. So one of my favorites, we use exemptions a lot, right? Something is exempt from something. And so I always like to have an aside here and just talk about the 3 different ways we use the term exempt. So the first one is the types of old pre-73 water rights that were exempt from filing statements and claims. That's one. And then we have the exempt wells or the exceptions to permitting. They also have a lot of names. We have a Form 602 Notice of Completion of Groundwater Development that's accepted from permitting or exempt. And then we also talk about ownership in these terms too. So you can sever, like I said earlier, they can be bought and sold separately from land. So you can sever water rights from a piece of land. And that is done through the deed, and it's done by either reserving or exempting the water from the sale. So that sometimes we call them the water rights exempt from transfer. So that's the 3 common ways we use that term. And so when people are saying exemptions, it's always good to get clarification on which exemption they're talking about in water. So how many of you have water rights in Basin 41F, the Madison River Basin? Got your decree mailing? Yeah.
Yep.
Adjudication is very active again. Second decrees are coming out. So any of the claims filed for water use prior to July 1st, 1973 are subject to the adjudication process or the decree process. And that's all through the Montana Water Court. DNRC, our adjudication specialists, are like technical advisors to the water court. We do reviews of these claims to ensure accuracy to the best that we can and follow very strict Supreme Court rules on how we can examine those claims. So here's just this, oh yeah,
I got a question on that.
yeah.
Okay, so, used to be, whether it's been changed or not, the water was deeded to a piece of ground, certain piece of ground on the ranch.
Yeah.
And say, you buy another ranch, you can't take that water and run it over there on another ranch, can you? Unless you go through
You can, but you do have to go through a process.
a process.
Yeah.
And if you don't go through a process, it's just like stealing water from the neighbors. Yeah.
Yeah, so water rights they're all very specific to where they can be used. and they are generally considered an appurtenance to
They're
property.
deeded to a piece of property.
Yep, and so if they're not gonna go with the property, the deed has to call that out very specifically. And then that water can't be used anywhere else until they come through DNRC for a change.
Okay, I've seen this, they bought, some guys that bought a ranch and then subdivided it and kept the water rights.
Yeah. So that's common, and actually depending on the size of the subdivision lots, there is a law under the subdivision code that requires that the water rights stay with the homeowners association instead of going to the lot owners for lots of less than a certain size.
Yeah, okay.
But the county has to enforce that through how that subdivision goes through the county process. We've got a few in Gallatin County that didn't get enforced on that, so we've got 0.1 acre lots that have water rights that are
Yeah,
messy.
there you go.
They're very, very messy. Yeah.
Or if these guys have still got the water rights to the piece of property that they sold 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's a mess too, because
It's a
you can
mess.
only transfer water rights that are severed through a separate water right deed.
Yes,
So we've seen that where the developer withheld reserves severed, and then they're gone, and it's in their name. And how do you, how do you get title to
and they're
the?
gone. How do you get water
Yeah.
back on the place?
Yeah.
Just go take it.
I know. Well, there's a lot of complexity like that out there, and that's one of my things. We get to do subdivision review ahead of time. I'm always like, is water rights planning in place? So it's
Ready
really
to buy
important.
another ranch and I said, well, we had water rights for that years ago. Well,
Yeah,
didn't get any when we bought the place.
yeah. Well, yeah, I just had that call yesterday, a different version of that where a rancher, I think, is selling off a parcel of his property that has water rights, but he's gonna reserve them. And it was someone associated with the sale wondering if the realtor could get in trouble because he's not gonna sell them, and the buy-sell says that, if they look at our records, it's gonna show there's water rights. Cause I'm like, yeah, we can't show that as severed until the deed is filed, and then they file that severance with us with that legally filed deed. So I'm like, but that's all part of the real estate disclosure piece, is they have to disclose, no, we're not.
And once you move it, that's where it stays permanently.
Until you change and move it again. You can
Well,
change and move it again
you
potentially,
can.
but
You
it's a
keep
change
moving around.
process with public notice where the public has an opportunity to object.
That's changed then since the time we were at another meeting down in Townsend, I guess, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
The guy wanted to take the water off this place, put it over here. Well, they told him he had one chance. That was it at that time. So that's changed, huh?
Yeah, and it depends too on the type of water, right? I mean, I don't know who was talking, but if, if it was like a share of a canal right and the canal's the owner, they may only allow. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to your
This is out of the
situation,
river.
but-
This is out of the
yeah.
Missouri, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, technically, we've had the same water rights come in for multiple changes. They can get bounced around. It's a process to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on our website, we always have the status of every basin in the state with respect to the water court and adjudication. And actually, this map was updated in February, and the 41F Madison River decree was mailed out March 1st. So 41F will then be changed to that darker blue color because it's been decreed, the second decree. But that's just a nice snapshot of what's going on statewide. So statements of claims, again, maintenance, make sure that they are saying what they should. So the second decree is really almost your last chance to get your water right with respect to that pre-1973 use. And so in 41F, you now would object if you still see an issue in your water right, 41F in Madison. The Ruby is actually going to go through probably the end of this year. So anyone with Ruby rights will get the same mailing probably the end of this year. And so what this second decree is it's part of what's called reexamination. So a bunch of these basins in this area went through a process called verification early on. And then we evolved and had claims examination. And then that got a little more defined into our current claims examination, which the later basins all went through. So we had the spectrum from kind of looked at to really looked at. And the water court had to decide, did any of these ones need anything else done? And while we can't go back and re-examine anything, we actually had consultants come in and cost benefit analysis. No, it's not worth doing everything. But here are the things that we decided would be worth it. Oh, I'm jumping ahead. I'm gonna go ahead a slide. So what re-examination is, it's a limited look. We are just looking at enforcement pieces. So are the diversion points located in the same place for the same ditch? That's important, right? The ditch only has one point. But some people would say it's the southeast is the northeast, the northeast is the southeast, or kind of the same corner, but not quite. And so we're making sure that it's a consistent diversion point, and also source names. Like my favorite example is Mulherron in Park County, but it's spelled two different ways. And we had it both ways in our database. So you could get an index for one Mulherron and an index for another Mulherron, but really they should be merged. So that's important too. And then we're also making sure there's no duplication. Sometimes we had filed rights that became decreed rights. And in the filing people were just grabbing all their paperwork. So the filed right had turned into a decree right, but they didn't recognize that, or just were making sure they got all their paper in. So it's sometimes the same filing got filed twice accidentally. So we're just making sure all those are captured. So, and this is the field I irrigated as a kid in Terry, Montana. Sugar beet land. So I'm just gonna go back one to make sure I didn't miss a point about re-exam. Yeah, so in the Madison River, the deadline for objections is gonna be August 28th. You got a lot of time to look. So I do want to encourage everyone, the decree process is really your last chance to make sure everything is accurate in our records, both for anything you own and anything your neighbors own. Now it is really interesting because Montana, we don't ground truth, right? We look at aerial photos just to make sure what was filed seems reasonable, but we really rely on neighbors, keeping neighbors in check. There's pros and cons, as you could imagine, to that. So there'll be an objection period first, and that'll end in August. And then the court will send out what's called the counter objection period. So that's where, like, okay, I wasn't gonna say anything about my neighbor, but he said something about me. So now I'm gonna say something about my neighbor, period. That's how I like to describe that. But yeah, so there'll be a counter objection period after the objection period, to where you can counter something that was objected on based to yours. And then after that is what's called, and this is the most confusing one, so I'm gonna ask for you to help me explain this when it comes out in probably a year. But it's the notice of intent to appear. It's the last phase of the decree notice. And that's the most confusing. We often get a lot of calls. But after there's been objections and counter objections, the way I like to explain the notice of intent to appear is, say you're all on Smith Ditch, and two water rights on Smith Ditch got lots of objections, and you rely on one of those water rights, is the largest one, and it provides the carriage water, we'll say. So you want to be kept in the loop with what's going on with those other two water rights. So you're like, I'm going to be just a notice of intent to appear, so I can get all the mailings on that case, so I know what's going on. We see that done also. Attorneys will do that for large entities. City of Bozeman did a lot of notices of intent to appear in the Gallatin. Other public water supplies tend to do a lot. Yeah.
Who's paying for all this process?
Well, the water courts, so, I mean, it's taxpayer based, right? It's all legislative and court ordered. So the Montana Water Court does a lot of this, and I can't speak to their budget. how much it costs. But they are part of the state budgeting, system, it's taxpayer dollars. And then our adjudication program, which does the claims re-exam side, is also taxpayer dollars, and we have been very accountable to legislators. I can speak to our side. I know that we've had very firm benchmarks in place, and we do a lot of reporting. There's an interim legislative committee, the Water Policy Interim Committee, and they have made sure we're staying on track, doing our job, spending your money wisely. So that is a piece of that for sure. Okay. So like I said, another main point, is everything right? So where do you look to see if everything's right? Well, we have a really good website. It's called the Query System. You can just search DNRC Query System and it should come up in a Google search. But what it looks like on our website is this. You can have a simple search. Note there's 2 tabs at the top, simple and advanced. That's often missed, so I like to point that out. But you can search by water rate number. Note that you have to have a very specific formatting if you choose the water rate number, and our formats have varied wildly over time. So you want to convert it to this format, which hopefully in some of the really old documentation will have GW letters in it that we don't use anymore. So just take those out, use that basin, space, number, space, extension. And you can do it by owner or geocode, which is getting better, but geocodes change a lot. And we have to manually check those. So always use a backup if you're not finding what you think you should be by geocode.
I do want to throw in, it's very picky on capitalizing the letter, the basic code. If you don't capitalize it, it won't find.
Yes.
What is that website again? Is it in this book by any chance?
Oh, it might be, but it, you would search DNRC query, QUERY, and it should come up that way.
So the website itself is WRQS, that's it for Water Right Query System, .dnrc.mt.gov.
Search it there. If you could put it up there, get there.
It is here, yeah. Thanks to Shannon.
I don't know what's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the advanced is really nice, and a lot of people don't notice that tab, so that's why I want to point it out. And you can pick an index type. It defaults to simple, but you can pick diversion, reservoir, priority date. So I recommend you kind of play around with that. And on this page, less is better. You don't have to fill in everything to get a search result. So just pick what you really want to see. So like everything on a certain ditch, just ditch name, basin or county works, and then a diversion index is the best way to get like a ditch index. This is the only way to pull up water rights that aren't active. So see the status here. If you know you have a pending or a terminated one, you have to go here and put in some appropriate other pieces to get that to come up. And then if you do a place of use index, then you can search by a township range and section to get like all the water rights in a section too. So it's a helpful tool that we often use too to pull indexes. And then one thing when you pull up a water right, there are 3 things you can look at. I do not recommend that map. It's just going to map the legal land description as a square. It's not very accurate. It'll get you a general idea, but you'd really want to go look in the document image to see what the actual map is for that water right. And most water rights have a map. Groundwater certificate wells don't always. See where that well is. Sometimes your guess is as good as ours on some of those old certificates. Abstracts are always helpful too, and that's where you'd get the water right abstract.
And in that documents area, any sort of update, anything that would go into the paper file. You have access to every single piece of.
So if you're looking for the maps, you'd want to start with what the file, the one that's named the file, because that was the main file at the time of scanning. And then a lot of water rights have a zillion updates, whether they're ownership updates or water court filings or, so we do get complaints that they're not more user-friendly, the update side. Sometimes there's a lot to click through, but yeah. So one thing to keep in mind when you're going through the water court process are issuer marks, and they're gonna get called out in boxes at the bottom of your water right. So the water court has to resolve these. Some of them go away if there's no objection. Some of them, the court's gonna make you bring in more information if you've got one. So that's just something to keep in mind, especially if you're based in 41F. They should all reflect any that you have currently. And then 41C, the re-exam is commencing and kind of starting right now. So you'll get a mailing before the decree where you have a chance to resolve things with us before it goes to the water court. And then if we can't resolve it, or say it's calving season, you can't get to it, you'll get a chance to resolve it in the water court as well. So just keep in mind that. So post 73, I've kind of talked about. We're gonna get into more detail. We're gonna talk about the exemptions or the exempt wells, and then permits and changes. So the groundwater certificates are most commonly used. That's when you have your own house well. Typically, you're filing one of these. They're one of our most controversial topics, if any of you follow that, in Montana water law. There's a real controversial legislative action proposed on this. But it's something that we always struggle with is we're not a one size fits all state, are we? The rural needs, and where I'm from Terry in eastern Montana versus the growing Gallatin Valley, right? So it's a challenge for us on those groundwater certificates. Oops. I'll go back. Anyway, the groundwater certificates, the limits currently are 35 gallons a minute for each groundwater diversion, and then 10 acre feet in a year. And that's typically for your property. Depending on your property and when it was put into place, different rules apply. So that's where we refer to as a combined project. So if a parcel greater than 20, your groundwater is combined together unless it's a certain distance apart, more than a quarter mile away. If you have a smaller than 20 acre lot, then you're a subdivision lot. So if you're in place prior to 2014, you're under a physical manifold rule. And if you're in place after 2014, you could be limited as part of a whole subdivision. In Gallatin County, I've seen more in Gallatin than Madison. We review all subdivision. We try to, any that come to us for review. So we'll sometimes get 10 lot subdivisions where each well can only do 1 acre foot in a year, which is the house at a very small amount and a teeny bit of lawn and garden.
If you
So,
have questions about it, I would recommend calling, like, if you know you already have a groundwater certificate and you're wanting to put more groundwater developments in and you're unsure about these combined appropriation rules, we can help through. I mean, because it is pretty complicated. So if you just want to give a call, explain the situation, can let me know if you have 10 acre feet, if it's going to be combined with others, what you have for your total project. I also recommend a voluntary call, not required, if you're going to put in a pond or a pit pond. Those volumes can get tricky to figure out how that's going to interact with your other groundwater certificates. So if you just want, a conversation ahead of time to explain your dimensions and your uses, you can see if that's going to fit in with your current uses. Not required, but it's helpful, so you don't get, the call after you permit the 602 that your pond is bigger and you need a permit.
definitely. So just really quick, I think Shannon covered a lot of that too. The tricky thing with these is you don't file them until after you've put it to use. So that's why, we've gotten these ones, we're like, oh, I thought that fit, so the planning piece, we're happy to help with that. And then the priority date is the date we receive it. That's really our biggest incentive. Other than also these can change at any time too. So they're supposed to be filed within 60 days of putting water to use. There's not a lot of enforcement on that. A lot of times these aren't caught till property transfers, but so you might want to check to make sure all your groundwater uses that need to be filed on are filed on. So ponds do need a water right. We have a pond proliferation in this region. We try really hard to keep them all where water lining is in place. So yeah, most of them are groundwater, and most of them then, if they're groundwater, can be made compliant with this exemption. Anything surface water should have a water right, and it's a closed basin. So surface water is hard to make compliant. You pretty much have to change an old water right to get a new pond in a closed basin.
And the one exception, there's not a lot of examples here, but you can make a stock pond on a large acreage on an intermittent ephemeral source only. So there's one small exception, but yeah, any other surface water needing to have a place of storage and a surface water rate for that, which can be added. It just goes through the change process, and it might require other trade-offs to get that consumptive use accounted for.
So this, we just like to remind people and help educate neighbors. Well logs aren't water right. So the driller, when the well is drilled, has to do a well log. And as of, I want to say the 90s, he's required to file that well log with the Bureau of Mines and Geology. So not all well logs are findable. That's a question we get a lot too. A lot of between that groundwater code where there was the county filing requirement and then the statute that required the filing with the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, there's this time period where they didn't have to be filed anywhere. So sometimes we get really frustrated realtors, where's the well log? We're kind of like, but hey, you can still get a water right. We don't need a well log for a water right. But yeah, so it is the Bureau of Mines and Geology has what's called the Groundwater Information Center, and it's a really good website. If you need to drill a well and you're in a new area, you haven't talked a lot with people, don't know the depth to water, you can just search their website, pick a couple sections in that area that give you all the stats from the wells in that area. Super helpful information. So yeah, so as of 2014, we're reviewing subdivisions for water, and then some subdivisions that were developed after 2014 might have a water limitation based on that court ruling and how we look at exempt wells in combination. Very complex topic. We just call us at any time if you're dealing with something like this. But yeah.
And just to point out too, if you're any type of subdividing of parcels, we get calls a lot about family transfers. They count as subdivisions as well. If you're gonna end up with lots less than 20 acres. So anytime you're splitting anything, not through a boundary line adjustments, don't count for that. But anytime you're splitting.
Unless your boundary line adjustment creates a lot less
sure,
than
yeah.
20
That's
that
true.
didn't
That's-
exist before.
So if you're messing with your boundaries, you might want to give us a call to figure out how it's gonna affect.
Yeah. Just proactive planning anytime you're doing anything with land that's different than how it's been. Okay, I'm about ready to turn this over to Shannon. And the application process. You want me to click slide?
Okay, so anything that requires an application, so that'd be any change to a 373 right or any change to any rate rather, and any new permit that's not exempt from the permitting process requires a permit or change in the application process. For these are, bigger and longer. The 602s are just, little one-page forms. You should do that after you put the water to use. This process you do ahead of time before you actually put the water to its new use. And what we do is we have, we actually are in the process of updating the process. I'll give you the way we do things now. But just know that this might shift with this legislative session to make it more efficient and quicker. But what you do is understand it takes time, so plan ahead. It could take a year.
New process will still take almost half a year.
Yeah, that's their shortened timelines, almost
We're
half
a
a
year
year.
now, if we're lucky.
We're about a year now. If complicating things come up like ownership or other unexpected things, it could take longer. So just plan that into any project that you're doing. And then what you do is have a pre-application meeting with us. So you'll get as much information as you can about what you're trying to do. Preferably look at the forms. Those are going to be our Form 606 for our changes and our Form 600 for our new permits. Just knowing though that it's a closed basin, that those new permits come in with mitigation as well to offset the new uses. Once you look through the forms, you have an idea of your project, you have a pre-application meeting with us where we all sit down and talk you through it, see if there's red flags, see if there's information that's critically missing that we're going to need to get it to go through the process as efficiently as possible. And I might have jumped way ahead, sorry. So these are our new permits, or the beneficial water use permits. That's Form 600. So that's going to be for any new use that's going to be greater than 10 acre-feet per year, 35 gallons per minute for groundwater, and then any new surface water use that's of any size. And just know, again, in a closed basin, that's going to require mitigation, most likely. So it'll be kind of like a two application process. You'll have your application for your new use, and then you'll have your mitigation application. Those can be kind of complex. So if you're not familiar with water rights, it might be helpful to get on a consultant or someone that is more familiar with the process. And these happen before you start any sort of development. I did talk about the stock water impoundments, and that's a very specific situation where you can actually have a stock pond, but you need to have 15 acre-feet per year or less non-perennial flowing stream on a large acreage to get that exception. And then to get a new new permit, you have to go through our criteria. And our criteria to assess whether we can allow this new use are there's physical availability, there's legal availability, you're not going to adversely affect other water right holders. You have an adequate diversion for what you're proposing, you have a beneficial use, and you have possessory interest in that property. So one thing to point out, all these criteria, we have information about them online, and we're also available to help answer questions. So if you're thinking about a new use and you want to know what we're going to look at to say yes or no, all of our manual with all of our criteria are spelled out online, and there's also in the Montana Code annotated, if you could kind of wade through that.
Our manual's much better.
Yeah, it's a lot more clear than the legalese. And yeah, so this is talking about the fact that new uses require mitigation to go with it. And this could even be new large groundwater uses. Say you want a new well, it's going to pump 100 gallons per minute. You will actually need to, in a closed basin, mitigate for the surface water effect of that groundwater use. So our hydrologists will do a model, figure out how you're going to affect the nearby surface water, and that's the amount of water that you're going to have to mitigate for in order to get that new groundwater use. And any sort of surface water use, you would have that direct effect to the surface water, which you'd mitigate for. Mitigation can be tricky. So for instance, you have an irrigation right. You want to switch, for instance, you want to switch from a surface water irrigation right to a groundwater irrigation right. Your ditch keeps going dry, you're not getting what you used to. You want to switch to groundwater. That can actually be pretty tricky, because if you put in that large groundwater pump, that's going to have an effect on those surface water sources that spread out throughout the year. And in that case, when you mitigate for that water, you're going to have to mitigate for that use throughout the year. Some people can get creative with it with stock water rights that are year round. I mean, there's ways to do it, but just know that, just putting in a pump because you're not getting what you used to get for surface water is not an easy thing to do. Change of water rights. So any sort of change that you do to the main elements of the water rights we talked about requires this change process. Should be changing your point of diversion, changing your place of use, changing your purpose, place of storage. We actually can't change period of use though. That's static, that would require.
These are the four elements are called out in statute. So those are the only four.
But that would require a change process. And we talked before about adding a place of storage. So you can add places of storage through the change process, and you would have to do that for any place of storage that's greater than 0.1 acre feet. And so it's the size of like a personal swimming
Yeah,
pool.
like 32,500 gallons. I looked. That used to be one of the biggest above ground swimming pools you could buy. Picture that.
Anything bigger than that needs to reflect it in a water right. And to do that, you would, go through the change process and you would account for the consumptive use of the evaporation. And some people retire acres or, other creative ways to make sure they're not adversely affecting or expanding their use for putting in places of storage. We have exceptions but it's tough. If you have a pivot that needs a certain amount of I'm gonna let you explain, 'cause this is a tricky.
Yeah, so I mean, just if there's something in a canal or ditch that is needed to convey the water. Actually, one of our local examples is right above Ennis Lake, the ranch, named the big ranch right above the lake.
Valley Gardens.
Yes, Valley Gardens. So one of their ditches got really incised and they're like, wow, we need to basically install little check dams to bring the water up to flow on the land. And they ran that through us because they're like, these check dams might be more than 0.1 acre feet when all said and done, by how long and skinny. So we ran that up through policy folks and they're like, yeah, that meets the exception. So they didn't have to worry about adding a place of storage with those check dams because of their inside system, because all the spring water comes into it on that canal on the valley floor there above. There's the terrace and then the floor and the ditch. So they were able to do that without worrying about adding places of storage.
And it's
The intent of it, we think we're center pivot pumping pits in a ditch too. And sometimes based on the flow of the ditch and what the pump needs, they have to be sized a certain size. The pump doesn't dry out or that doesn't get left dry. And so those can be exceptions as well. But basically, we are with our current policy direction, we've really tightened up on those. I think previous staff in our office would have given much broader direction on that exception, but now our current policy staff, like if it's a reservoir with evaporation, generally we're going to want to see in a water right.
So if you have questions about that, that's where that pre-application meeting is really
Or even the
helpful. Or even the
scoping, yeah.
scoping.
You don't have to know it all yet. Just come in and talk to us.
Yeah.
Proactive planning, we love.
Yeah, the scoping meeting, the term we use is like pre-application. If you really don't know all the elements of what you're proposing, you don't really have a clear idea, but you have questions, then you can have a scoping meeting with us and we can kind of talk through some of those things, like whether you'd need any exceptions or whether you'd need a change or what types of changes or, those big picture questions you can come in for and have a scoping meeting. Okay, special circumstances. Basin closures, there's different ways. Basins were closed to new large surface water uses, legislative closures, compacts. There's different closures. Just know that Madison County and Gallatin County are closed to new surface water appropriations that are larger than the 35 gallons per minute, 10 acre feet per year. And in order to have any new large uses, it requires changes in mitigation and other creative ways to keep using the water beneficially and allow for development while also protecting what the legislator considered to be a very appropriated basin that needed to be closed. Controlled groundwater areas are same sort of things. They could be closed for many reasons, like there's a Yellowstone controlled groundwater area. It's not closed, but if you need to have a new water right in there, it requires extra hoops to make sure you're not affecting the geothermal features.
There's other types of closures, like in Bozeman, there's some sites that had some, chemicals spilled and they're closed. So essentially you don't get contaminated groundwater you're using. There's a map on the next page of the different controlled groundwater areas. And then the compact closures. So this is a map right here of all the different types of closures we have around the state. And you can see in this area, we have the Jefferson and Madison basins are closed by legislative action. It just means that the basin's appropriated and new uses are going to require, shifting around things that exist or mitigating. Still possible to develop, it's just more complicated to make sure we're not over appropriating things. Mitigation, I talked about this.
We're not sure on time, and this is a complex topic.
Do you want to take
We're
this one?
skipping-
Oh,
we're
okay.
skipping. Come talk to us if you need to mitigate something.
It is pretty complicated. I kind of went over it a little bit.
Yeah.
anyways.
Shannon, I thought covered it really well earlier, actually, so both, all of this, if you want to skip the next couple, I'm open to that.
Yeah, I'll just say, you might see diverted and consumed. A lot of you might understand that consumed is what the crop uses or what your purpose actually uses. It's not given back to the system. Diverted is the amount you actually need to take from the system for that use, but some of it will return via return flows or wastewater or other ways. And this is a little diagram that shows that.
And it's only that consumptive portion you have to mitigate. So there are non-consumed uses that are easier to get to, like hydropower. Had some people wanting to do small hydropower. Those can be pretty easy depending on where you're at and if you're right on stream or you don't take the water very far off and there's no one in. So that's something that can still be done.
And it's also important to note, in many cases, it's only the consumptive portion that you can change as well to different uses. Okay. Do you want to take the ending?
Well, we want to talk, so one thing, if you have a change or a permit, so when you come in for those, you're getting permission to do the work. And you still have to tell us how you did the work when you're done with it. And so sometimes someone got permission and then they sold the land. And then the new people didn't know they had to tell us. So we try to send out postcards when these are due, because if we don't get a completion notice or an extension request, they are gone. They're terminated, done. And so we try to send out postcards. We've had just a couple of occasions where it was a new owner and the old owner's just like, and we're trying to call, no one's answering. So those water rights have gone away, and that's problematic in a closed basin. Maybe that you could get that water right in 1990, but in 2020 you can't. So that's just something to keep in mind and check if you have newer permits or changes that might not have a completion filed yet. Just make sure you're aware of when that deadline is.
I think we want,
Just, yeah, the maintenance again, measuring is good, so you have that data, pictures of use.
anything that you can document will help with future changes, either for yourself or the next person. If you want to sell the land, it's much easier to change if there's documented use. And we talked a lot about why it's really important to have accurate records.
Ownership. Both for notice through the water report process, through our permit and change process, and then water distribution and enforcement.
Let's see.
Very sad, Claude's retired. How many of you know Claude? The water commissioner, Claude Mulholland. He does a lot of Madison County, so I assume everyone should know him. He used to. He's trying to retire.
I guess we are. Do you want?
Yeah, I think we've talked about ownership, making sure everything's reflecting well.
And this might be something, it's also another large topic, but easements and access to ditches are not water rights, they're separate topics. Do you have a quick explanation?
Just ditches, we are not ditch experts. That's where you do have to go through an attorney and usually get legal court type resolution if you have a ditch issue you can't resolve neighborly. We can give you general information on ditches and, but we are not ditch experts and we cannot give legal advice. So unfortunately, there's a lot of ditch issues with new owners and houses and subdivisions. Yes, question.
How long was that process taking for like the mini hydro plants where they're just kind of diverting it and then dumping it back in?
It'd be the same process, but quicker on the end, like
Yeah.
more like a year at this point.
Well, yeah, just because we have a lot in hopper and to be in line, but those are typically pretty quick. But one thing we would want to see before you come in are measurements on the source, unfortunately. I like to argue we don't care, but our policy folks want to see water measurements and know that you have the water available to you. So that'd be the most burden before coming in. Is ensuring what water is from that source.
Okay. And water resources survey, I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. If not, all of the ditches and irrigation places are used or mapped. This survey is available online. It's still incredibly useful.
Yeah, so going through the water court process, we rely heavily on this when we're working with water court cases. And so this would be like, if you've got an issue remark on something, this would be one of the first places you want to look. Is not just the surveys themselves, but there are notes from their visits. Every ownership they visited, they marked ditches used by that owner and the lands irrigated by that owner. So that's really valuable information. Yep, more records. Keep records, data. Well, this is one of my soapbox topics. It's a little more prevalent in the Gallatin right now, but it is really interesting and it applies to any sort of mountain valley basin. So first there were the beavers and they held the water back, stored it, kind of elevated the groundwater. Then there was flood irrigation. The farmers, they ran water through ditches, flood irrigated. We have these artificially elevated aquifer systems and then late season flow to rivers. And then now we have land use changes, flood the pivot, less ditches. So we're not storing that water as effectively in aquifer. So we're seeing that change both in late season river flows of some sources and groundwater levels. And there's areas in Bozeman where they have to drill deeper wells just because the groundwater is falling. Not significantly yet, so it's not a crisis, but I just like to, this is where keep the ditches going where you can. That's where mitigation is actually really helpful. Two is that infrastructure, there's still a need for it. In the Gallatin, the ditches seep at 1.1 CFS per mile. So that's a lot of water getting into the groundwater system. So there's groups trying to see to make sure we can keep the infrastructure in place and not let them line it. Unfortunately, ARPA was like, line your ditches. Like, no, please don't. Because that's the funny thing is we learn more and what seems like an efficiency for water move, like pivot irrigation. In the end, maybe wasn't the best efficiency for the system here, but the Ogallala aquifer, yes, great. But for these systems where we're storing that water and it's late season flow for our fish and wildlife and our own personal recreational enjoyment, then yeah, that's very considered of moving forward.
And this is just our website. It's had a new update. If you haven't checked it out recently, it's a lot more user friendly. Might also be, you want to know where anything is. If you're used to the old website, feel free to give us a call.
Yeah, we're like, where is it? I can't find it.
And with that,
Eventually we found it, or we ask and they add it back, so.
and again, I apologize. We apologize for running late. We are incredibly swamped right now and time.
I'll take the book.
Okay. Yeah, he did.
Was in there for an hour and a half today. But it's okay.
And we're still working on his solutions, but we'll get there. Questions, everyone's got a book. Call us,
So
email us anytime, yeah.
in the Madison, when you guys went through and did the big pivot project,
So that would be the NRCS.
now you're saying like the water table's down. 'Cause
I'm not saying that
A
here,
little
I
bit.
don't know that, I just know that.
I've read reports that says it.
Okay, as I say, the Bureau of Mines and Geology is sort of the entity that studies that, and they are generally finding that when in the studies they do.
Now, I guess my question is that because of, it's just the evaporation wasn't calculated appropriately, or they allotted more pivots then should have been.
So pivots, the thought with pivots were, we don't need to divert that much water and take it from our rivers. We'll just take the amount we need for the crop. And pivots are very effective at that. What we did not realize, and what was an unintended consequence, was that that extra water was getting stored in the groundwater. And then coming later, and that maybe that was even more beneficial, saving it from the pumping originally. And so that's what wasn't realized. And that's why I don't know the history of the pivots and the pivot cushion, NRCS and all that funding.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously a manpower issue there too. I grew up on a farm. It does take a lot more work to flood irrigate than pivot irrigate. And I know it can be hard to find people to work in agriculture. So it's not like an easy black and white. Whose fault was it, right? It was just some unintended consequences that we're now aware of. And hopefully, like Idaho's gone a few steps further. They fund and incentivize people to remain in flood to keep those flood irrigation. Other entities and other areas are looking at ways, can we flood and then pivot, or do pivots at higher rates? Or, is there any way we can mimic some of that older aquifer storage? And so there's some work to try to get back and save some of that and still do that.
If you look at soil saturation with a pivot, you're only getting like 4 to 6 inches of saturation versus like flood irrigation, you're getting deeper. A lot of that water is stored in the plants at that point in time. And I know I've talked to our NRCS folks quite a bit. And pivots are good in the right application. If you're in a losing system where your water is just going to who knows where, then that might be a good place to put in a pivot. But if you're on the floodplain, then you're gonna or should use flood irrigation, just so you can store that. So come in into the office and we can have a full conversation.
It's really interesting.
It's almost like its efficiency is kind of the shortfall, because it's putting exactly the amount of water you need in exactly the spot you need it. So the requirement of that upfront water demand is less, but then you're only pulling out what you need to grow the crop. So then all that moisture gets sucked up by the roots and there's no groundwater recharge. So it's like the inefficiency of the flood is kind of. its
Was a benefit we didn't appreciate.
Yeah, we didn't realize at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Thank you.
Questions? Wishes? We have lots of wishes. Yes. All right, well, thanks so much for having us. Again, apologies for being a little late. Appreciate your patience with us.
And just always feel free to comment or give a call. We're
Yeah.
definitely happy to answer any questions. Do you guys have free time tomorrow? I'd come to the office.
Oh, yeah.
Just go all the
Yeah.
questions. Yeah.
I'm gonna get there.
Yeah, I don't know my
My
schedule,
schedule's
but I
pretty
think it's
open
pretty
tomorrow.
open tomorrow
Yeah.
too. So between the two of us, one of us will
Okay.
help you out. And I come in, see, depending on my schedule.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we're always open 8 to 5. Someone is always there. Sometimes it's Lyra, our new person, going, I was here for a week. Can you come back?
Somebody be on YouTube.
I think if I have any questions for you guys. I heard any Madison rumors.
About Ruby,
Ruby, yeah.
or anything.
Yeah, has that court case been come out yet through the water court?
I haven't been keeping up on it. I know it's interesting.
That one was,
We have a monitoring system on all the tributaries and
Okay.
the landowners reached out asking for that data, which is not ready yet. And I told him, I was like, you cannot use this. It's not accurate. We're done with it. Still requested. Okay.
yeah. That's good to know. Shannon's our hydrologist, so we're always trying to keep it by being on who might be measuring things too, in case we need.
We have 5 monitoring sites across the tributaries of the. That's great to know. I Yeah. haven't heard about that.
Yeah.
If you do come in, I'm gonna pick your brain on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bring your map,
Oh,
measurements.
take care. Absolutely. It's on our website.
Okay,
So you
good.
should be able
Good.
to at least find it.
how much, so if you're looking at, a modification to an existing water right, an inversion, whatever, how much would that cost to file it with you guys?
If it's a full change, it's 900, but if you do a pre-application meeting, it's 700. I really want to get that pre-application meeting in.
$100 off.
There are some types of smaller changing like things like a replacement point of diversion, for instance, that would be different and less, and all that's on our website.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we're relatively inexpensive, but sometimes we require things like if you need to do water measurement. That can get expensive if you don't have that skill yourself, or pump tests for new wells can be expensive, that has a component. Try to be cognizant of that and only require what's needed.
So for new, sorry, now I'm here. For new subdivisions, so, I'm sure you've seen the one coming in Sheridan. What would their water right look like? I know that they're trying to tie into the town,
Right.
but do we have that capacity? And if we don't,
Great question.
how does, what does that look like?
Yeah, no. That's really interesting, because it's like if, I did look at that subdivision and I'm like, part of it is, it is up to Sheridan to know their water rates, because, these towns that have multiple water rates and have this kind of portfolio, it's gonna be hard for someone like me to just look at them and know, right? I can tell you whether that new subdivision was in a place of use of that or not, and I think it is actually. So that's why I'm like, well, it's up to Sheridan to know if it fits, and I know they just have done replacement wells to kind of make sure they can get their full flow and volume on water rates.
Yeah.
So the thing that is really a challenge for towns and public water supplies is they can look at their water rates and I've got this flow, I have this volume, I'm good. But then it depends on the nature of the water rates and how we would look at them. Like if they had to come in for a change, we're gonna be like, what did you perfect? Like you filed that on a claim, that's not reserved for future use. You have to show you perfected that.
Yeah.
Permits, we get, a lot of permits where they came in and then filed the completion right away when they got all their piping in, but they never actually used all that water. And so we changed policy from the 80s to now, so they have to come in with a wrong form filed and an extension request saying, well, I didn't perfect my whole permit. I still have, so many empty lots in the town to perfect. So it's can be really tricky with public water supplies. And I know Sheridan's done a few things like their replacement wells, or not, they did a redundant well. That's what it was, a redundant well, just add it to the system as a backup.
But it was deeper, wasn't it?
It was in a whole different aquifer.
Yeah.
It actually was kind of lucky for them because we look at aquifers fairly stringently. So it would have been harder to do a replacement well or a change. So the redundant well was the easiest way to go, but they didn't get them new flow or volume. But yeah, if they can stay in their same footprint and they aren't exceeding their flow or volume, no one's gonna question that either. It's our change process right now, the way we currently do it, where it can get messy. And then that's one thing I wanted to ask. The town of Ennis is putting in new wells too, and I'm like, I know nothing about that. So if you know anyone from the town of Ennis, water right planning.
I was talking with Mike, the mayor, and this is kind of the dumbed down version, so I could understand it. Was when they originally did the calculations, they're like, yeah, we have plenty of water flow, this will go through. And then someone came in, maybe a hydrologist or a specialist, saying, well, you calculated this wrong. You need to be able to take out your primary well or water supply, and then on like your second, third, can you still supply everything if your primary goes down? And they're like, oh, and in that circumstance, I don't know if we do have enough. That was the last I heard.
So maybe it's just a redundant one.
Have you heard of?
Well, so I got
Something
one
like
of those
that.
general request comments, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, new water supply well, that's usually like, ding, 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 for us. And it's like, what's the water rate planning on this? So I like to know they at least have someone knowledgeable in water rate saying, yes, this will be a redundant well, or we're gonna come in with a change, or I don't think Ennis did a reservation, so a lot of towns had a reservation that did grant them a little speculative water. That's our only like allowance of speculation in statute or reservations for cities. Conservation districts had some too, in some instances, not all. But yeah, so, yeah, I'm hoping that it was just a redundant one and someone's on that. but-
Sorry.
No, no,
I'm curious.
it's good, and that Sheridan subdivision, that's big. I actually called a friend of mine who used to live there, it's like, what's going on with this, do you know?
So have you heard anything then as far as, on like the groundwater rights with this proposal for the 300 slip RV?
Mile Creek?
Reynolds
Yeah.
Pass, cause apparently and this is hearsay, I wasn't there, but apparently the developers at the last planning meeting said that, someone raised a concern about what the water consumption is gonna be with that of groundwater. And one of the developers argued that groundwater has no impact or interaction with surface water, which is a pretty well-known fact when we learn the water cycle in third grade. So, yeah, I was just curious if you've heard like any.
So I've reviewed that project as well. They are able to get in under an exception or the exempt well. Water use is under 10 acre feet. And that, you've got, gallons per person per day for campgrounds, per size of, there's the numbers are out there in general. In general, our numbers are a little higher than what's actually used, so it's fairly conservative. So yeah, I mean, they stay under that 10 acre feet, so there won't be a full permit. And we did, the consultant, the engineer did contact us to ask about aquifer testing, so they are gonna do some testing when they put in the well too, to help kind of bolster their arguments, I think, on what the aquifer